Joining us for this conversation this morning, you know how they say there's some things that appear like Halley's Comet every 85 years, and I don't know when the next one will be, but there's a rare sighting of Rarieda Constituency Member of Parliament Otiende Amollo, and he's here in the Situation Room this morning. Mesh, good morning.
Good morning to you.
How are you doing?
I'm good. In the circumstances.
Yeah. Of course, our deepest condolences, and those continue. They will for a while, to then be able to soften that sore spot that is there. But you know, it's good that you've come, and thank you for doing that. Talking is cathartic, as they say.
Yeah, that is. It is. It's exactly a week since Mzee passed away, and so it's been a very eventful 7 days.
Yeah,
and I'm glad to be here to talk to Kenyans as we all share in the grief. I just didn't know I was that rare. I know that in the past few months, I was on a self-imposed sabbatical from media appearances, but I think the death of Raila Odinga has shocked us back to action.
Well, I'm glad that you chose to be here this morning on your comeback. Dennis would like to share a proverb with you, and of course we'd love your interpretation.
Yeah, so the proverb today comes from Cape Verde, also known as Cabo Verde, and it is a country that was discovered by the Portuguese explorers in the 15th century, around 1456. At this time it was uninhabited, and became an important slave trade hub between Africa, Europe and the Americas. Now, it gained independence from Portugal July 5th, 1975. But from this great country, we have the proverb, what is united will not be lost. What is united will not be lost. How would you interpret that?
I think that's probably a proverb that has the same meaning as we always say, a people united cannot be defeated. And essentially that's what it is. That in solitude you can only do so much, but in unity you'll do much more. Much more. And an interesting proverb at this time, because I think that's exactly what we need in my party ODM at this particular time. Yes,
it's interesting that you said that, because we can jump right into the waters, can't we, Otiende? Because you say you need unification, you need unity in the party. Is that to suggest that there isn't?
As you know, historically, ODM, this year we are celebrating 20 years since the creation of ODM. And in those 20 years, ODM has grown to be the biggest party in this country. And not just in this country. I believe it's the biggest party in East, Central, and Southern Africa. It can be contested whether it's bigger than the ANC or not, but it is indeed the biggest in this region. It is also the one party that is most democratic in terms of expression. In ODM, we have always tolerated divergent opinions, and our fallen leader himself would allow and encourage divergent opinion on a number of subjects, so much so that people would ask, how come if some people speak, they say this, he supports, the opposite number speak and he supports. That is the ODM. And I'm saying that we need to sustain that, because there are people who have misinterpreted the expressions, even within the ODM, even after Mzee has passed on, to mean that they are wrangles. Those are not wrangles. Those are democratic expressions of opinion, which will has always been the case and will be the case until the organs of the party formally meet to take a position. And that is when the majority will have their way in terms of persuasion. So those are democratic expressions. They are not wrangles. But at the end of the day, we need, as we have always needed, unity of the party. Also, as we face the various by-elections that are now coming, and it is the first time that we are going to face these by-elections without the appearance of our fallen leader. So we certainly need to sustain that unity.
We talk about unity at a time when, especially on Sunday, when Baba was being buried and statements that were made there, and there was a clear divide on that. And as we look at ODM as a party, many are asking what is left of the party, because one would say, even callers have called us and say, ODM was Baba and Baba was ODM. How does ODM shake that ideology that without Baba it's dead?
Well, the ODM was founded in turbulent times. Mm-hmm. It was at a time when we had the original ODM with the bigger ODM, where even Kalonzo was in and all that. And we only discovered with very few days to elections that my friend Maanzo had secretly taken the registration certificate. He had taken it, and basically, with my other friend Kalonzo Musyoka, they had bolted with it. And we had to quickly find a way of registering a party. Fortunately, Wakili Imanyara had already registered a party which he was willing to give to us. And so we had to go to the registrar to persuade the registrar to change the name so that the name could be ODM. The registrar was unyielding. And on that day, we marched to the Attorney General's chambers. As they usually would do, they locked us out, refusing us entry. We climbed that gate, myself, TJ Kajwang, and Janet Ongera. We scaled that gate and physically pushed the administration police officers who were there, and we stormed the office of the registrar. We refused to leave. There was a standoff for about 3 hours. So as we were inside, and the ODM members were starting to swell around the AG's chambers, and it was becoming totally unmanageable. They brought the police, they tear-gassed people, but people were not leaving. That's when they decided to give us that certificate, at least to ease the tension. So we walked out of that compound. Again, they still didn't open for us the gate. We came out the way we had gone, by scaling the gate, and then amid jubilation. Now that's how we got the certificate for ODM. From that time to date, the single leader and symbol of ODM has been Raila Amollo Odinga. So there's no going saying that without him, there's a void there that is difficult to fill. Fortunately, though, over the years, the ODM has established, I think, more than any other party, very, very clear structures, from the Central Committee to the National Executive Committee, to the National Governing Council, and various layers of leadership, from the party leader and 3 deputy party leaders, from the party chair, 4 deputy chairs, the Secretary General and the assistant, the treasurer, and all those. And so there are very clear organs from the grassroots. The ODM is the only party to juggle so many things, to bring diversity of opinions into a unity of purpose and voice. And so those who say that are actually quite right. But as they say, life must continue, and the party must also continue. What we need to do is, in the absence of such a strong voice, such charisma, what must replace it is the singular speech and voice of the party. That we may disagree in terms of our approaches, but once we sit down as a party and decide, then we all agree with the singular voice of the party. That is what must happen now. Now, let me explain something around that. I know that even from the speeches at the funeral, there are those who interpreted it that there's a divergence of opinion. For example, when Sifuna spoke, when Osoti spoke, and when the other spoke. There are those who are, saying that, there are those who wish that we draw away from the support of President Ruto. There are those who wish that we continue and sustain it. And then there are also those who are not quite in the party now. They remain members, like the Waziri Mbadi, Waziri Opiyo Wandayi, Waziri Oparanya and Joho. They are no longer officials, but they remain members of the party, but they've joined the executive. Now, we have to be very clear when people are speaking as whom they are speaking, okay? First of all, My understanding is that so far from all the speeches, there is no divergence in terms of where we are. And let me explain it. We had signed the 10-point framework agreement that Raila signed with Ruto that requires certain things to be done. Some are being done, some have not been done. We are all united in urging the president to honor Raila Amollo Odinga by ensuring that the 10-point agenda is fully implemented. There's no divergence on that.
Sorry,
Number
so if
two.
that is not implemented, then there's no support for Raila Odinga?
No. We've not said that. We've said to honor the life of Raila Odinga.
Okay.
Let us ensure that the 10 points are fully implemented. That's number one. Number two, in that context, we joined the broad-based government. Like any government, it has a 5-year lifespan. The 5-year lifespan of this government is up to 2027, which means we continue, and no one has said others, we will continue to support this government in the context of the broad-based government for its lifespan. That is up to 2027. Now, up to his death, Raila had not pronounced himself on what happens in 2027 moving forward. Now, that's where the speculation begins. There are those, of course, who are already in the executive, yes, who naturally must urge the party to continue its support beyond 2027. And you cannot fault them because they're already in the executive, as they have robustly expressed, Honorable Wandai, Honorable Mbadi, and the others. That's number one. Number two, there are those in the party, like our Secretary General, who say that this agreement was only up to 2027. That also is a fact. And that beyond 2027, we must determine what to do. And that chances are that the ODM might have a candidate. That is something that had been said even when Raila was alive. And in fact, that is something that even Raila himself said. So whether he would be the candidate or not is a matter of speculation. Some are even saying that the ODM candidate might actually be President Ruto. I mean, ODM is a democratic party. Anyone is allowed to join, and then we determine who becomes the candidate. And then there are those who say that the broad-based means 2-term for President Ruto. Now, that's beyond 2027. And as I'd said, up to that point, anybody is allowed to speculate. There are those who want us to say 2-term for President Ruto. There are those who want us to say we do not have a candidate, we support President Ruto. There are those who say we must have a candidate, and then there are those who say we can have a candidate, it can even be President Ruto. All those are speculative, and all that is democratic because the framework agreement does not cover that point.
Okay.
That is the point where we as a party will be discussing. So all those expressions are quite consistent with the framework agreement. They are consistent with what Raila said. They are consistent with democracy. So that is not a disagreement.
So when we talk about the broad-based arrangement, the 10-point agenda, I mean, it's been a while. And the simple question that Kenyans would want to ask today is, fine, you got into these arrangement, broad-based government, there are 10 points that you wanted to implement, but there's always a scorecard. How has it fared as a member of ODM? You are in Parliament. Some of these issues would land in the National Assembly. How have you fared with implementing the 10-point agenda? Have we made any strides?
Well, I think there are areas that have been covered, but there are many more areas that have not been covered. I would say that we are lagging behind in terms of implementation. Some of the areas are actually quite difficult. You know, like one of the areas we are grappling with is how to deal with the 2/3 gender in terms of implementation. And as we speak, there's even a proposal that has been brought to amend the Constitution, and we are actively discussing it. And the question is, we amend the Constitution and increase the number of nominated women, and by that calculation, I think we would be increasing it by about 91 to achieve it. And the opposite question is, do we have the finances to sustain additional members of parliament? And so we're actively discussing it. This is a discussion that has taken the last 15 years.
Indeed.
You can't just resolve it immediately. But it is the recognition that it was not moving so fast, that President Ruto and Raila Odinga appointed a 5-team. You remember that 5-team led by Dr. Agnes Zani?
Yes.
To fast-track that implementation, to look into the specifics of what there is, and they are actively on it. So I believe that, and they have been engaging. I think they were given a limited period. I believe we should be able to achieve most, up to maybe at least 80% of what the framework agreement considered, if not 100%. But some of them are not easy matters.
We live in a pressure cooker society whereby you're not interested in having the thing on the coals for it to cook slowly. You want it in 7 minutes, you want it out now. Raila Odinga's buried on Sunday. And of course, many things are already popping out. Otiende, who's going to lead the party? Will Oburu Oginga be the one who leads the party? All the things that you talk about, people want to know who is the one who is going to lead to ensure all of these things be done. And with the fissures that, whether they are imagined or real, folks are asking, who's going to lead? And that also could be a bone of contention. Is it?
Yeah, well, that's where Kenyans need more patience than that pressure cooker society you're talking about. We've been urging Kenyans and we've been urging our members to at least allow some mourning period, some little healing opportunity, and not jump into these speculations and issues that as if we were in a hurry, to make sure our fallen leader is immediately replaced. For now, as the National Executive Committee, we met on the day that Raila's remains were being brought, and we unanimously endorsed his brother, Senator Dr. Oburu Oginga, as the acting party leader. In terms of anyone wanting to know, that should be sufficient for now. He is the acting party leader, and the organs of the party will meet later and make a decision for confirmation or otherwise. That, therefore, should be sufficient for now. But, the problem with people, it's at two levels. It's the question of who will lead the party.
Yes.
That has already been answered because Dr. Buru is the acting party leader. But then as a community, there are also those who are asking who will lead the community.
Or who will replace Raila Odinga.
Who will replace Raila Odinga. These things, for party leadership, you can meet, you can elect, and it is resolved. For a question like who will lead the community, that is not an elective position. That is not a thing that you can declare that I am now the leader of the community. Those are things that emerge with time. Raila was never elected to lead the Luo. He emerged to lead the Luo. And he started, even when Jaramogi was still alive, he had already started rising. So in terms of who will lead the Luo, we will leave that to time. And we are not in a hurry because that's not an elective seat. We will see how that plays. It might well be, and we hope not. The Luo are a very interesting people. Historically, do you know most kingdoms were established by the Luos, including the kingdoms in Uganda, including the Baganda kingdom, the Banyoro kingdom, most of those kingdoms. And what they would do is they would come, establish a kingdom, install a king, and then rebel against that king and move on, and leave the king and the family, to become part, of the tribe, where they had installed them. So that is what happened, and until they got to Kenya and established the Wanga kingdom. And then moved on from the Wanga kingdom. I see
you laughed at that, but
okay. So the Luos are not an easy people. They are not a people you can impose yourself that I'm now your leader. They are people who can choose to accept you or otherwise, and that we will leave to time.
Okay, I have to ask you a question about what the president said. and he was clear that we are not going to allow anything to break this apart. In your assessment, was he referring to the broad-based government, or was he referring to the ODM party? Because speaker after speaker after speaker, speculation after speculation was that the ODM party must remain. Whether we're talking about Waziri Joho, Opiyo Wandayi, John Badi, James Orengo, Osotsi, everybody, Gladys Wanga herself as the chair of the party, everybody came out. Millie Odhiambo came and said the same thing you did yourself, that the party must remain intact in order for whatever to happen. The president also seemingly said the same thing. But what we don't know is whether he was referring to ODM as the party, which would give rise to maybe he could be a candidate for ODM, or whether he was referring to the broad-based government. What's the case here?
In my understanding, the president could only have been referring to the broad-based government because there is no way President William Ruto, who's the leader of UDA, can then speak for ODM, which is, for all intents and purposes, a party in competition with UDA. It is my understanding, and that is why all were united in strengthening the party. Whether we decide to support William Ruto in 2027 by not having a candidate, whether we decide to have a candidate to run against William Ruto, whether we decide to if you want, accept William Ruto as a candidate in our party, the first thing that must be done is that ODM must be strong as a party and not be swallowed by UDA or any other party. And that is not to deny support to the broad-based government. We are in the broad-based government because the government is UDA, but we as ODM have come and lended support to UDA by donating our experts. If we were to be weakened to the point that we do not have a strong voice, then we would not have a party. And certainly, the president cannot, for now, cannot be the spokesperson for ODM. In fact, for ODM to be useful even to the president or UDA, ODM itself must be strong independently as a party. Then my understanding is that when it comes to 2027, if President Ruto still desires the support of ODM, then we must enter a structured negotiation again. We must be very clear that if we are to support UDA, what are the gains? What are the bargaining points? And we cannot do that if we are strong, if we are not strong. We cannot do that if we allow ourselves to be swallowed into UDA for now. And that is why, irrespective of what anyone says, we must remain strong and independent as a party first. Then we can have a strong bargaining and negotiation position. Otherwise, we would have been swallowed into UDA and there would be no interest in negotiating anything with ODM. And that is why my understanding is that the president could only be talking about the broad-based. The president, what the president needs to do is to maintain non-interference with the ODM as a party. That is what would be helpful.
I mean, let's look at the broad-based 10-point agenda. And the reason why I'm talking about the 10-point agenda is at the time when it was formed, one of the key agendas that was there was to deal with police brutality, and that comes to an end. And at the time when those were the irreducible minimum, you see a year later, and there was the killing again of Kenyans in the country. And one would say that we did not hear the voice of ODM as had been before. But let's extrapolate that even further to when Raila Odinga was being taken to Kasarani, and we saw Kenyans who were killed in the presence of a man who fought for these rights, a man who, through the broad-based government, has said no to police brutality. But up to this point, you look at the legacy that was Raila Odinga, and his party, ODM, has not spoken about the killings that happened on the very day. Begs the question, why then is ODM in a union that whose leadership is going against the very agenda that they agreed to deal with in the first place?
First of all, I think a number of people have called out that issue. You remember even at the funeral, Dr. Akinyuenwa spoke to it. And certainly, police brutality is of serious concern, which is why it was in the framework agreement, and it is a work in progress. And I must say that while I think that the police have shown greater restraint than was the case. You remember, like when we were doing the demos and all, the brutality was at another level. In later times, even with the demos that I now saw, the police have generally shown more restraint. Not that police brutality is gone, it is still there. But I think the fact of having put it in the agenda, required, and with the change of leadership at the IG level and at various other levels below, I think the police have shown a little more restraint. I will tell you, for example, that on the day Raila was brought, and we had all calculated that it would be brought to Parliament, and there was a way that, it had been agreed. And we had all thought that having called Kenyans not to go to the airport, but instead to come to Parliament, Kenyans would come to Parliament and line up and wait. But Kenyans are Kenyans, and when they're mourning their greatest hero, it's a different matter. They broke all cordons at the airport, and they came even up to the airside. Now, the police showed restraint at the airport because they could have tried to use force to prevent them from coming. But I think, acutely aware of the situation, they decided that they would rather allow the breach of air protocols, and by the way, of course, we raised some things there, than use force. Then when it came now to Kasarani, first Parliament. I left the airport and dashed to Parliament because I had still hoped that we would manage. While in Parliament, as we were having a brief meeting with the committee, because I was representing I was actually calling the committee, then we realized that the crowd that was waiting had actually already breached, and they were in the process of breaching the walls of Parliament. Some were on top of the gate. And when I went, I realized that there were hundreds of thousands of people outside of Parliament, and they were threatening, to come into Parliament. Well, even up to that point, the police at least restrained themselves. You could see they had just pulled back. It took me, and I think Babu Wino, we had to jump into that crowd, just to try and talk to them and tell them that what they are doing, if they breach Parliament, they will actually not just be betraying, they will be giving the police a reason to stop people from viewing. So we jump right into them and talk to them, and since many of them, they were all Baba's followers, but a majority of them were Luo, obviously. So we were even talking to them in Luo and persuading them and all. Let's just say we managed to stop them from breaching Parliament. Okay? And so as they were coming, in communication, once it was decided that the body goes to Kasarani, because when we were telling them, now we are going to view in Kasarani, they were telling us, no, you people, you must have hidden Baba's remains somewhere. He's not going to Kasarani. So we made sure that the group that was moving toward Kasarani moved slowly enough around Parliament so that they could see. And that's when a majority of them joined the convoy as it was going to Kasarani. Now, and in Kasarani, I think there was a mistake collectively as organizers, because the state had taken over. All this was being organized by the state, essentially the military. But I think the military are not a very communicative unit. So there was no one in Kasarani to keep talking to people to tell them what was happening. And what was happening, one, is Raila's body had to be moved to Kasarani, but the viewing could not start immediately because they had to do the embalming, having been transported. Now, in that time, Raila is not at the airport, he's not in Kasarani, and there's a lull. So people are thinking they were duped, and no one is talking to them, you see? So that lull and that delay, I think, was the problem. And it was the problem enough that caused the attack. Now, at that point, I think it's understandable that the police may have used force to restrain, forceful. But I think they should, at the very most, have used rubber bullets, not live bullets. Because it is clear from the autopsy report that all who died out of bullet wounds.
Yes.
And I thought that rubber bullets would restrain enough without having to kill anyone. And therefore, I personally call out the police for that. I think that was totally wrong. We should not have lost lives for people mourning Raila Amollo Odinga. Yes.
Okay. So even obviously that should not have happened. It's been called out on very many occasions since then by a number of people. And just looking at then what happens thereafter, and looking at a legacy that was left by Raila Odinga, it's not something that can be forgotten. And I've been talking about this for the last couple of days, that my mind goes to the video of the young lady during the protests in 2024. And she said, Agwambo, leave it to us. You have done this for the longest time. You have taught us. Now let us go and do this. So that spirit is very much alive now. This is somebody who is educated. She's thinking. She's clear on what she is seeking for the country for tomorrow, coming from what Raila Odinga has said. So she knows the agenda for the people. Now, I want to go to some of the people who are surrounding Raila, who, from what we hear, might be scared, honestly scared, because they may not come back to government. That people voted them in because Raila said so. Is that fear genuine?
Well, it might or it might not. And from where I sit, I think there's a sense in which there's been an exaggeration in terms of who Raila made to be elected or otherwise.
Okay.
I can tell you that, for example, these last elections in 2022, in all the elective positions, from governor to senator, member of parliament, and at least up to member of parliament, what at the instructions of Raila, the party did surveys, very quiet surveys, not by one company, but by two and three companies, three separate companies. And the surveys would be like in Rarieda, where I represent.
Yes.
Who are the candidates? What are their popularity rates? For the whole country. Where you hear that there are people who got direct tickets, it's because those ratings by three different companies brought results showing that the popularity rate, is above 70%. In those instances, Raila instructed it would be a waste of money to conduct party primaries, because party primaries are quite expensive. Those who don't know might think that those who got direct tickets, it was because Raila had their hand. No. Raila is a very practical man, was a very practical man. He would only give you the direct ticket once he was sure that you'd win. There are instances, and some people blame Raila. For example, in game, my friend, the late Jacoyo Midiwo, did not get the ticket. Why? Because of this same assessment, despite the fact that he was Raila's cousin and a very close confidant, twice. So Raila would practically follow the scientific, ratings. Where the ratings was low, then the party primaries would be conducted. In other words, it is my understanding that those who are rated highly would still be rated highly even if Raila Amollo Odinga is not there, because I believe we would still use the same processes. Okay? But it is also true that there are people who depended on Raila to be sustained or even for politics, especially not so much in terms of ratings, but in terms of agenda. Okay? But you know what? Elections should be about serving the people. If the people you serve determine that you have done your bit or failed to do your bit and need to elect somebody else, there should not be any problem.
Okay.
Because that is the nature of elections. And so I think that we're in a situation, just like we are facing the by-elections that are coming now, we're in a situation where people will still robustly, voters, they will still robustly either be elected or unelected. And if you are not elected, you just thank the people for having given you the opportunity to lead them.
Okay.
If you are elected, it is your business to do that which you promised the people to do.
Let's take that to the presidential level. Because also, and it's interesting because this conversation is around speculation, but to a great degree, but truthfully, speculation sometimes then becomes a reality. Now, when this happened, before anything had even been said or done, speculation again was rife that President William Ruto then may be a bit nervous about the future. Entering into a broad-based government, one of the things that they said very clearly at that time was that there needed to be some kind of stability in the country, especially following the protests against the finance bill in the middle of 2024. And that to join hands into government in this instant would bring about, an acceptable level of peace, and that there would be some kind of stability. And ODM coming into this agreement with the Kenya Kwanza government essentially is what was seen to be able to do this under the leadership of Raila Odinga. Exit Raila Odinga, and that support then seems as though it's wobbly. So, does the president have something to worry about?
Well, certainly. And I think in his speech in Bondo, the president acknowledged that. He acknowledged that the absence of Raila certainly puts him in a difficult position. I mean, that is the naked truth. Because it is true, as you say, that where the country was headed, had Raila not joined hands with William Ruto, we could have been in a different position. And that explains one of Raila's most outstanding qualities, the love of the nation of Kenya as a nation. Throughout the years, you will realize that no matter what it was, if it came to a stage where the nation of Kenya as a nation was threatened, Raila would back down, even against opposition. In 2007, a lot of the people around Raila, including President Ruto right now, did not want Raila to back down, to join in the unity government. A lot of people were against it, but he insisted and said, we cannot take Kenya to the dogs. And that is the position he has maintained in every other subsequent election. And that is the position he maintained during the Gen Z's revolution. It was not for him, it was not for ODM, but it was for Kenya as a country. So the fact, the nervousness is real, and the president himself has conceded that. But I think that, there are moments when things can happen. And if that moment passes, usually you do not, it's not easy to reenact it. I think that while some of the concerns by the Gen Zs have been addressed, many have still not been addressed, but that moment passed. That is not to say that we can, wish away what the Gen Zs were raising. They must still be addressed. But I think that moment, it was actually a revolutionary moment. I think it passed. I think it toned down. And we have got to a situation where, and it's very sad, that in Raila passing, I've been seeing a lot of, in the social media, even the Gen Zs themselves are in disagreement. There are some Gen Zs who unfortunately have been celebrating the death of Raila, and there are Gen Zs who are mourning. And so they've ended up in this fierce exchange, almost violent exchange on social media. The point is, the unity of the Gen Zs at that point and the purpose for which they were, united was real. It was hijacked by other people who wanted to use it for a different reason, and we can discuss that at a later date. But that moment passed. The president is nervous and has to be nervous, but I do not think that the death of Raila Amollo Odinga by itself can recreate that moment. So I believe that President Ruto will and should serve his term up to 2027. Beyond, we can discuss. But I also believe that we must all strive to address all those issues that were of concern to the Gen Zs.
Do you think that Kenyans today, as we sit and remember the person Raila Odinga was in terms of his democracy and fight for freedoms that we have today, that Kenyans, where they are, and even when Kenyans get out to go to the streets, that they embody the legacy that the man has left, that Kenyans today would say the foundation blocks that were built by this man, Raila Odinga, are what you're building on to make Kenya a better place. Are you able to say, or are you able to comment in terms of Kenyans know their rights, Kenyans will get out to fight their rights, and that as a leadership, we see a people who know what they want, and we don't have an option but to play right by them?
Both yes and no. Yes, in the sense that the surviving legacy and the greatest legacy that Raila ever gave this country is an enlarged democratic space. And anyone who knows anything about this country and about Raila will acknowledge that the democratic space we enjoy right now is courtesy of not only, but topmost, Raila Amollo Odinga. And that is why Kenyans will go to the streets, and in this country, there's not a single day that there's not a demonstration somewhere. A lot of times you watch news and it's one demonstration to other, so the first 5 clips are about demos in different places. That democratic space that Kenyans enjoy is courtesy topmost of Raila Amollo Odinga. And so Kenyans can rest assured and continue enjoying that. But at the same time, no. Because one of the things Raila fought the most was tribalism. Unfortunately, in this country today, tribalism continues to rear its ugly head, even in unfortunate situations like the death of Raila. I must call out, for example, you saw the video of the governor of Nyeri, Governor Kahiga, celebrating the death of Raila and saying that was God's work, that God had to eliminate the Luo leader because the Ruto's government was now taking resources that belong to the Kikuyus, to the Luo. It is quite unfortunate. In any proper democracy, not only must he resign as the vice chair of the Council of Governors, he actually needs to resign as a governor. If as a governor you can think and celebrate death of somebody based on tribalism, it tells you how deep it is. And what's worse is that as he was saying that, the crowd that was there was cheering.
Sure.
It tells you how deep in tribalism we still are. It is unfortunate that although many have mourned Raila, and if you look at those who went to receive his body at the airport, to those who are in Kasarani, to those who are in Nyayo, to those who are in Kisumu and Bondo, a lot of my colleagues from Mount Kenya skipped all those events, most of them.
Why?
It is my opinion that it is still a result of tribalism because of the perception of, the some of the utterances by the former deputy president and utterances by people like Governor Kahiga that is trying to create and balkanize, the Kikuyu as a tribe, and that if you are seen either sympathizing too much with the death of Raila or at his funeral and all, your electorate will mark you out. And I believe it is that fear that kept a lot of them away. It is all about tribalism. So unfortunately, while we all agree that the democratic space has improved courtesy of Raila and we all enjoy it, tribalism has not improved. And although Raila tried to fight it both in deed and action, unfortunately, it is embedded and it is becoming deeper and deeper.
Obviously, yes. It's going to be interesting because we do know that the Council of Governors has actually called a meeting for this morning at 9 o'clock, probably to address this very thing, to look into that. But speaking about things that are said and things that are done, Parliament would appear passed a number of bills that were being signed into law at around the same time that Raila Odinga's death and the news of it was made known to Kenyans. We didn't hear anything from State House until later on in the day. What we did hear before was that these bills had been assented to and signed into law by the president. This was 4 hours after Raila died. And they're already being called controversial bills. They've now been signed into law. And it looks as though they are betraying the very freedoms that Raila spent his life defending. Amongst them is the new Cyber Crimes Act. And it tightens the safeguards against online fraud and harassment and hides in clauses that would muzzle free speech and silent dissent. We can take those 4 words and use them to describe Raila Odinga, whether you woke up in the middle of the night or you did in the first dawn. Those are some of the things that he did fight for. But interestingly, on the day, and maybe in this case coincidence doesn't even play, but on the day he died, these bills were signed into law. Call them controversial, call them whatever you want. But in order for them to have been signed into law, Otiende, they were discussed in Parliament. 1, 2, 3 times they were read. They were assented to. They are now law. What are your thoughts around this?
Let me explain first the circumstances of the assent, then I come to Parliament.
Okay.
I have seen, I think a lot of people have faulted the president for signing into law these laws on the very day that Raila died, and they have speculated that he actually learned of Raila's death, then purposed to sign them. That because if he had not signed them until then, because he had feared Raila might not be very happy. I think it's a case of a sad coincidence, because I'm aware that the leadership of Parliament had been invited to State House the previous day. To be there, I think, as early as 6. And the agenda was actually signing these laws into these matters into law. I cannot speak authoritatively as to whether they were signed before he landed or after he landed. But I can tell you for a fact, because I confirmed with some of my colleagues, in the leadership, the whip, that they had been invited the previous day. So I think the purpose to sign them was always there. But I think it was a sad coincidence that they were signed the very morning that we all learned of Raila's death. About Parliament, I can tell you that while the broad-based government is a good thing for this country, I think one of the unintended effects it has had on Parliament is to reduce the level of scrutiny and opposition to bills that may not be good.
Does it mean members of Parliament are failing Kenyans?
Yes, I think we are. What it has done, some of us who question this are then said to be opposed to the broad-based government. I have, for example, because I have usually questioned some of these matters during debate, and then they have then concluded, some people have concluded that I'm one of those who are opposed to the broad-based government. But that is not so. I support the broad-based government, but that 10-point framework agreement does not say anywhere that we must support legislation and proposals even if they are not correct. And therefore, I have continued to speak out against what I think are proposals that are improper at whatever cost. For example, when before the last session, there was proposal to privatize Kenya Pipeline Company, you remember?
Yes.
I spoke very strongly against it, and a lot of our colleagues were in opposition, so that they withdrew the bill. And then, the way Parliament works. And then this session, what they then did is on a particular day when we had seen the order paper and nothing like privatization of KPC was on it. And so no one was prepared. And then at about 2:30, they circulate another order paper that now has it only to those basically who are in the house. So some of us now learned, and by the time we got there, it had been endorsed within less than 30 minutes or something like that. And I'm on record as questioning the speaker that is a misuse of amendment of the order paper. The order paper is supposed to notify not just members of Parliament, but everyone at large that there will be this business at this time.
Right.
So I called it legislation by ambush. And so some of us have continued to call this. When the cybercrimes law was being debated, we opposed it. But what happens in Parliament ultimately? There's something called mood of Parliament. That mood is the most difficult thing you can deal with, because you can go there, you have your minutes, sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 5, you will wax lyrical about why the legislation is bad, what it will do and all that. And the speaker and the rest of your colleagues will just be looking at you. And then the speaker will put the question. Once that question is carried, that's it. Whether you opposed or not, collectively, they will say Parliament passed it. So even those of us who opposed it, you are lost in that sea. And so there's nothing you can do. You can roll on the ground, you can jump, you can go to a witch doctor, but it will not change the decision. So I think that it is true, and I'm on record. I think Parliament needs to be more independent than it is, because collectively we are supposed to check the executive.
So deeper than that,
yes.
We're saying that, are we saying that because of the broad-based government, members of parliament who ordinarily would be in a position whereby, remember, the sovereignty has been delegated to them in terms of representation, that of the people to then be able to state their will and their desire has been delegated to this, just under 400 people for the entire country. We're saying essentially, because it's broad-based, that there are members who have shirked their responsibility and want to assume that because we're broad-based, then anything goes. Is that the case?
Yes. Let me explain. Even before the broad-based government, Parliament was passing legislation, policies, motions that some of which were not quite correct. And we would speak to it, we in the opposition, because the UDA, the governing party, had a majority. With the broad-based arrangement, there are those of us in Parliament who see the 10-point agenda, although it does not cover Parliament, but they interpret it to mean that we as ODM are in government, not that we are working with government. My position is that we are working with government. We are not the government. We are in government but working with government. But then there are those who interpret it to mean we are the government. And what therefore they interpret it to mean that any proposal from the executive is a proposal that must be supported. I do not take that position. But the result of that is that now the UDA and team does not just have a majority, it has a super majority. Even the little voices of opposition in terms of adjustment are then quelled, because when you speak, then they say you are opposing the broad-based government. And that is how they have categorized some of us. But I'm not afraid of that. Now, so what that has done is that it has reduced the level of scrutiny of proposals from the executive, because of the perception that we are the government, whatever comes, we are bound to support. And in doing that, we therefore have lost, the authority that is given by the people collectively to check the executive. We have voices that endeavor to do that. But when you have the supermajority in Parliament, when you have the Speaker of Parliament, who is actually a leader of one of the parties that formed the executive coalition, then you understand why Parliament may not be as robust as it ought to be. And I admit that collectively, we are failing Kenyans. And we ought not to do that. But I think the saving grace is this too. Whether few or however few, I must encourage those of us who still have the courage to call out the things that are wrong, to continue calling them out, even if we lose out in numbers. But secondly, the saving grace is that a lot of times, and if you look at a lot of these laws, if you look at the clips that I usually contribute in Parliament, I would always remind them that, remember that we whatever we do might still face scrutiny in court. And in many times, my predictions in terms of how things will go in court have come to pass. So the fact that the courts remain to review what Parliament has done is also another saving grace.
Doesn't the then broad-based arrangement that is there defeat itself, especially on things it's supposed to achieve? Because if Parliament has failed to do that which it's supposed to do because others think that we are in government and we support this, then broad-based is dead on arrival. It's not achieving its purpose.
I think it's an unintended consequence, but it is a consequence. It was never intended to be so, but indeed it is a consequence. A lot of times in Parliament, when things are to be done, they would also, there are those people who would come and tell you, Otiende, this thing that you're posting, it is actually Baba who has instructed that we go the other way. Fortunately for someone like me who was always very close to Raila, I would call him and ask him, is this the position? And many times he'd be surprised to say, but I've not discussed this with anyone.
Right.
So the fact that Baba is not there might help the situation a little more because people will not invoke his name, the level of independent thinking in terms of how to debate, how to vote might improve. But for those who would not be able to call him like I would, a lot of them were swayed by that persuasion that it is actually Baba who has instructed.
People listened to what he said, and it's interesting because before we had you in this morning, Kenyans are of the mind that, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of entrenching some of the things that he did say, which made sense for the country. And even with that, we listened to person after person tell us that Raila spoke to them. He said to me, he called me on this date, and it seems as though he said many things to many people about how he wanted them to operate. What did he say to you?
It's interesting you say that. I actually spoke to him 4 days before he died. I had called his number. It didn't go through. So I called one of his closest aides with whom I knew he was, called Keta. Keta gave him the phone. We spoke. And we spoke because he was actually to be in my constituency on 18th, this last Saturday, during the homecoming for the PS for Health, Dr. Oluga. And so I was concerned when he was not back, so I was asking him whether we should postpone the event. And he told me, no, Otiende, I'm actually feeling much better. I believe I'll be in the country and will proceed with the event, which was not to be. I chose not to discuss with him many other things because I could hear he was training in speech. And so I told him, we will maintain it, but let me let you relax. Yes, having said that, I'm not surprised that there's so many people who say they spoke to him. Because one of the things about Raila, he was hands-on on everything. If he didn't call you for a meeting to discuss something, he would probably call you to discuss it on phone. And he was hands-on on very many things, especially concern of the forthcoming by-elections. He was trying, he had his hand and his ear everywhere, from Magarini to Ugunja to everywhere else where these by-elections were coming. And in fact, just the day before he died, I think he'd spoken to Governor Wanga, and Governor Wanga called me about what we needed to do for the by-elections in Ugunja, being that now in Siaya I'm the highest-ranking party official, and we had agreed with Gladys what we would do, especially once he was back. So we'd schemed it out, and of course now that was never to be. So I think that those who say they spoke to him, they obviously did. It is also true that when you are referring to a person who's deceased, you can even put words that may not have been said, but there's no one to contradict. I just hope that everyone who said Raila told them what they said, they truly did, because to speak any falsity in respect of a deceased person, I think that would be an abomination. Yes.
As we look at politics, there are things that are said, whether they're said atop a roof of a vehicle or whether they're said in a stadium packed with people that would then sway people in a particular direction. Should Kenyans believe politicians when they say things in rallies? And there's where I'm going with this.
I wish I knew where you were going, but let me answer you for now. They don't have a choice. You cannot live without politicians, hate them or love them, because ultimately the governance structure is such that you will be governed by politicians. The president will be a politician by default, whether or not a career politician. Once you are president, you are a politician. The governors, the senators, the members of parliament, the MCAs, will be politicians. So whether you hate them or love them, Kenyans do not have a choice. They will always be led and governed by politicians. Should you trust what politicians say? Well, that's the question that the electorate must determine. If you elect somebody on the basis of what they promised, then you should hold them to account. And the examination for that is the next election. That if then they said things that they did not do, or they say things that are false, elect them out. Whether it's the president, whether it's the governor, whether it's the MP. So you ought to believe your politicians, but if the politicians don't do what they say, elect them out. That is the test. But Kenyans don't have a choice. They must learn to live with politicians. They must endeavor to elect politicians who say what they mean and mean what they say.
Okay. So has the broad-based government taken on this persona of telling folks that things will happen and then they have to wait for them to happen if they do? I know you did say that just because you are sharing in this government per se doesn't mean that everything that happens you have the stamp of endorsement on it. But you know what it is, that, you know, if an apple is rotten and there are other apples in the general area, something is going to take on a bit of the besmirching of the rotten one. That's just how things happen. So we hear things promised over and over again. And if I see Otiende Amollo today, I'll say, okay, well, that's what they think. They've told us that is what is going to happen. How do you separate the two?
I think we must be fair to the ODM party.
Okay.
And those of us who are in it. Merely because we support the government does not make us the government. And therefore, the successes or failures of the government in its entirety cannot be visited on us. Okay. I know where you're going with this, and I suspect that your issue is with President Ruto, that he may have promised some things and some of them he may not have fulfilled. I think it is fair to hold the ODM to account in terms of those promises insofar as they are within the 10-point agenda.
Okay.
But if it's outside the 10-point agenda, you cannot put that load on ODM. Because even for us, like the rest of Kenyans, we would want a situation where every promise is fulfilled. But in the context of the 10-point agenda, as I said earlier, there's an endeavor to fulfill them. For example, when it comes to compensation for victims of police brutality, which was stopped by the court. Now, I know the matter is actively before court, so I will not talk about the substance of it. But from where I stand, I had no problem with it. Because you cannot have too much of a good thing. If we agree that victims of police compensation should be compensated, and there's a mechanism to compensate them, it is that mechanism should not be stopped, because it does not stop any parallel court process. If it ends up that a victim of police compensation is compensated twice, what's wrong with that? You know, for me, that was a way so that even the ones who died recently during the stampede and in Kasarani should be added to the list so that they are compensated. So issues like that which are in the 10-point agenda, we have really pushed. And sometimes you are held back, for example, by the court stopping the process and all that. But insofar as the 10-point agenda is concerned, I think you cannot really fault anything that the ODM has promised and not done. Okay. Beyond that, as the rest of Kenyans, we must hold the president and the executive to account for their promises.
But you see, even as the blame game now, who is to be blamed, who's not to be blamed, there is the collective ideology that stands out in terms of public participation. And matters to do with public participation, there is public participation on paper and there is meaningful public participation that Kenyans do yearn for. And even as you talk about the bills that took place, many Kenyans say, we just saw this being appended to. In terms of proper public participation where Kenyans would come on board and give their views on these matters, usually seems as if it is a suggestion and not a requirement by the law. So in terms of politicians out here and listening to Kenyans hold the view that you do not care. How do we change that perception so that as Kenyans sit and even go to vote, they feel as if, as much as we don't have an option, we will be led and governed by politicians, that people we have donated our powers to do listen to us, that when public participation is asked for and is required, we actually see a meaningful public participation. You rightfully said, Raila Odinga conducted surveys, and that survey, one would say, is public participation to show exactly the matter on ground. Why not see the same that is truthful and open for Kenyans?
Well, what I'll tell you, first, the idea of public participation has not been clear because so far we have not had a law that defines what public participation is. I'm happy to tell you that as a team in the Justice and Legal Affairs Committee, we are currently considering both the Justice and Legal Affairs Committee and the caucus. There's a parliamentary caucus on legislation, which I'm co-chairing. We are currently considering the draft law on public participation, which we are going to introduce in the next session. The consideration is more or less ready. That defines how public participation should be done. So far, public participation has not been well defined, but as Parliament, to be fair, we have endeavored to do it. Because every law, before it is considered, there'll be a notice in the papers. Sometimes it involves traveling to strategic places in each county to get the views of Kenyans. Sometimes it involves telling Kenyans which email to use and which social media handle to use to give their views. Sometimes it involves inviting them to the committee sittings which are open or inside or outside of Parliament. So I think in fairness, we have endeavored to do public participation. Secondly, you'll be surprised, a lot of draft bills have been changed because of what Kenyans have said during public participation. That report usually is taken seriously. And because it's also part of the report that is public and comes with legislation, we have many times changed the provision. Because subsequently, anyone who goes to court will not just challenge the law, they'll even use the report itself and be able to say what Kenyans have said. What I can tell you, though, is Kenyans are an interesting lot. Given the opportunity for public participation, the trend that I've seen, one, usually NGOs and other bodies, non-governmental bodies that have an interest in that particular matter are usually the ones that will then come to the committees to give their views or write to the committees. Most ordinary Kenyans do not take time to respond, whether in person, or even by email. They easily would rather come to a show like this, and say, I oppose this. But just writing to the committee and say, I oppose this for this reason, very few. That's the interesting thing. Unless you actually go and invite them. And when you do, like you're going to do public participation in Siaya, the interesting thing again is that those who come usually will be people who have been facilitated by other people, either who are in support of the bill or who are opposed to it, not those who come voluntarily that they want to speak. So that even the public participation in Kenya is usually skewed in terms of those who have vested interest, either for or against. But the opportunity is usually there. But I think it will be made much more clear when we pass the law on public participation. But secondly, there are a number of members of parliament who take the reports of public participation quite seriously. They will all, I can tell you, not all is lost in parliament. There are between 10 and 15 members of parliament who will usually robustly go through these things and speak to them.
Out of 290.
Out of 290. A lot of the others go with what is called the mood of parliament.
And then maybe one of the greatest expressions of this public participation that we then experience at the moment, maybe in its purest form, is during an election.
Yes.
That is when people then are saying what they feel and they are participating in this particular thing.
Yes.
There are by-elections that are coming on the 27th of November. In certain parts of the country, people will speak. Before the death of Raila Odinga, it was said that this will be a litmus test as to whether the new founded opposition, after having removed ODM from the opposition for all intents and purposes, that the newly minted opposition was going to see whether it had any weight and would then then be able to destabilize the government of William Ruto. That has kind of changed now, because in just 7 days, people have said this is now a test to see whether the ODM party can push an agenda in the absence of Raila Odinga. Has the litmus test changed, in your opinion?
Not in any substantial way. I think that in terms of the by-elections and in consideration of the broad-based arrangement, the ODM party and the UDA had already agreed that the seats that were previously held by ODM members, UDA would not front candidates and vice versa. And that is holding. And if it is holding, it means where there was a UDA candidate, there is no ODM influence that will decampaign the candidate, and vice versa. Where there's an ODM candidate, there's no UDA that would decampaign our candidate. And we are confident that for those who are supporters or members of ODM, the death of Raila should motivate them even further in terms of those who are in doubt. Your way of mourning Raila would be to support the candidate of his party. And we are confident that, unfortunate as it is, I think that the death of Raila Amollo Odinga will further galvanize the electorate to vote in the ODM candidate wherever they are. What has changed is this dynamic. Up to the point of his death, Raila Odinga had not indicated either way whether would be a candidate for presidency or not in 2027.
And that was a possibility.
That was a possibility. In fact, he had indicated to some that he would be running. Without him, the ultimate question would be whether the ODM would still decide to front a candidate. And the biggest question, if that is so, would be who? Now, that is the one big thing that will be discussed much later. As for the so-called united opposition, they are allowed to do their thing because this is a democratic nation. You saw that even though not everyone spoke at Raila's funeral, at least Kalonzo Musyoka was given the opportunity to speak, also as a former vice president. And I particularly urge the committee to allow him to speak, because it's not about anything. I mean, he was close to Raila, he was his running mate, basically, and stood by him at least in 2 elections. And in eulogizing such a person, it was right that he was given the opportunity. But I think that the united opposition is not as united as the name sounds. And really? Obviously, you know that.
What would make you say that?
Because I know for a fact that a lot of people there are united only if they will be the candidate. The moment they are told you are not the candidate, they will bolt out, because there are many who have declared that they are united, but they are the candidate. You cannot have 4 united candidates, So I think that they have a bigger task than many people think. I think that it is easy to appear together, to address press conferences together, to say you are united, until the ultimate test, who is your candidate? Now that's when the rubber will meet the road. Yes.
But even as we talk about the united opposition, there is also the question that we've been discussing in terms of just how united ODM is. But you've mentioned about the by-elections and how that is a litmus test. And you've negotiated with UDA in the spirit of broad-based that none of the parties would field candidates in areas that would be considered to be the stronghold, or the parties, relevant parties, held the position. But a Kenyan from that specific area, constituency or ward is asking, but what if the person you're denying not to run is the person that we want? Why not allow everyone to run and the best candidate to be elected based on merit?
Well, the fact that ODM and UDA have an arrangement does not deny other parties from fielding whoever they want. In fact, as far as I know, in most of these constituencies and wards, there are more candidates than 5, some between 5 and 10. So any Kenyan is free to elect whoever they want. including the right not to vote. If you feel so disenfranchised, you can choose that none of these candidates are suitable and therefore I'm not voting. So no Kenyan is denied any right because you still have an array to choose from, including one of not voting. So I think that would not be a legitimate question. But I think it is fair because to have a situation where you have a broad-based understanding and then in each constituency or ward you have an ODM candidate and a UDA candidate would be very confusing. That on the one hand, at the national level, you are saying let's work together. Then when it comes to the constituency or ward, you have parallel campaigns.
But
it becomes very untidy.
But the arrangement itself says the agreement is not political.
Well, it is not political, but is in that spirit of the arrangement, it is not necessary to antagonize each other. The fact that in a particular place, those very electorate chose to elect a UDA person and ignored the ODM means they prefer UDA as their party, at least the majority, and vice versa. The fact that they elected an ODM person and not a UDA person, it means the majority prefer ODM. So we are going with that spirit of the expression of the electorate as at the last election.
You know, the reason I'm asking that is because we talk about Kasipul, and we just spoke to residents of Kasipul, and they say ODM tried to push Boyd Were to be the candidate, but the locals say, we do not want that, we want the opposite. So what happens if this opposite person actually belongs to UDA? How do you go about it? Because here, it is the people who are saying who they want. It's not about what UDA wants or what ODM wants, but what the people want.
The way to answer that question is to ask, in the last election, how many votes did the UDA candidate get?
In Kasipul.
You will hardly find any, negligible. So no one in Kasipul will legitimately say that by not allowing UDA to field a candidate, that they're being disenfranchised. In any event, there is always the option of running as an independent candidate. If such a person thought that, they're disenfranchised, they can run as an independent candidate. But in the specific case of Kasipul, ODM is a very democratic party. There were democratic nominations that were held. If there was any complaint, it would come first to the body that runs our election. But beyond that, we had an ad hoc committee set up purposefully to receive complaints from any candidate for these by-elections, wherever they were held. There was no such complaint that was received. If there was, then it would have been received and processed. So anyone who says that the person who was nominated is not the person they wanted, then should have complained. They should have lodged. And the complaint, you're allowed to complain to the internal mechanisms of the party. Beyond that, you're allowed to complain to the political party's tribunal. Beyond that, you're even allowed to complain to the High Court. None of these mechanisms were invoked. So anyone who says that would either be lying, or if they are not lying, then it would mean they are lazy. They chose to sit on their rights, and now you can't blame anyone.
Well, we're going to keep you just a little bit longer because, like I said, it's like Halley's Comet. Every 85 years, we don't know when we're going to find you again, So you're here to discuss a number of things for us. And of course, now, when we're looking into the 10-point agenda, there are very many questions around, so exactly what did this mean? Before these protests, there was no talk of a 10-point agenda for these things that are fundamentally important to the livelihood of Kenyans, right? Of course, people were disappeared. We know people till today who cannot find their sons, who cannot find their children, who showed up dead and nobody's answering questions, for who inquiries have not been made. This was before June 2024. So those were issues that were very pertinent to the people of Kenya. And I know you talk about the importance of realizing that 10-point agenda. But is it for the people? And you have a responsibility on your shoulders, Otiende, to convince Kenyans that truly this is for the people. You talk about donating 4 generals of ODM to the broad-based government to work in the capacity as cabinet ministers, their expertise in whatever level that might be. But looking at the broader lines, the broader brushstrokes of this, is it for the people of Kenya and is it for Kenya?
The answer is an unequivocal yes. it is for the people of Kenya and for the broader interest of the country. Number one, I think everyone would agree that the Gen Z revolution, if I would call it that, was well-meaning. I will tell you that my own daughter, for example, took to the streets, including that morning, and I personally facilitated her to go, because she told me she genuinely believed, in protesting what they thought were wrong. The irony is, on that day, when we were invaded in Parliament, they were infiltrated. That the real Gen Zs who had come to the streets, now there are others who had infiltrated them, who are now, the previous days, the Gen Zs had come and it was peaceful. You could see them with their phones, take, pictures and all that. But then there was this invasion by another team who were actually robbing the Gen Zs who were protesting. They were stealing their phones. They were becoming very dangerous, so that the Gen Zs who were genuinely protesting got into danger. So when the Gen Zs invaded Parliament and it became chaotic and we all kind of retreated, and it was really, really chaotic, my daughter and my nephew were also now in danger. So, they were on, the main street opposite GPO. They had to climb on top of that petrol station, the concrete slabbing. Yes. Because that's the only place they could take safety. So she, who had gone to protest generally against certain policies, including Parliament, where I sit,
where her father is,
now was calling me to save her because now they couldn't leave. So I had to, and there's no vehicle that would come, so I had to get some border people to navigate and come and get them, dodging bullets and dodging all sorts of things, because the real Gen Zs were now outnumbered by others who had infiltrated their course. And where we were going, I think Kenya as a country, it was not just about the policies anymore. I think where we were going, we were going to collapse as a state. And in my view, it may not be popular, and many still faulted Raila to his death, that he should not have saved this regime. In my opinion, it was right for Raila to step in, join hands with William Ruto to save the country. And therefore, it was definitely in the interest of Kenya as a nation. Because if we didn't, there's no telling where we would go. There are times revolutions start as revolutions, well-meaning, but where they end up, you end up with a collapsed state. Now, that would be unfortunate. And I think Raila explained this numerous times as the basis of his joining hands. Secondly, in now then coming to the 10-point agenda, it was an effort to synthesize some of the concerns that were raised by the Gen Zs. Concerns that were legitimate and concerns that need to be addressed whether or not there's a revolution. So the 10-point agenda was actually extracting the concerns, some of the concerns that earlier had been raised by ODM, in the NADCO talks and all that, and then subsequently by the Gen Zs in terms of the most critical areas. So both the coming together and the framework agreement were and are still definitely in the best interest of this country.
And is it just within those 10 points? Because from what you're saying, there's already an agreement around elections, for example, that don't field a candidate here where ODM had previously had one. And if there's somebody who is speaking to the spirit of what ODM has fought for example, in Baringo, I honestly choose Baringo randomly. If there's somebody in Baringo who is running for the and going towards the spirit of what ODM fights for and happens not to be UDA, would ODM support that individual? Or are we saying, apart from the 10-point agenda, we're also going to be able to dabble here and there in terms of who can be fielded or who cannot?
I wish you chose a different example. Because Baringo, let me explain, because Baringo was never an ODM zone. In fact, the negotiation in Baringo, as you know, it was between KANU and UDA. Because some of those areas, we must be real. Yeah. We know where our following is.
It's a sample.
So there, we will just sit and watch them, slug it out or negotiate as they did. Right. Well, for us, our position would be that let the residents of Baringo exercise their democratic right within that context. If it was somewhere like Ugunja, for example.
Okay, let's go with Ugunja.
Yes.
We like Ugunja. All right.
To say that we've negotiated with UDA not to field a candidate is merely to relate to the reality. In the last election, in Luoland, UDA was a far cry. In my own constituency, there's a guy who ran for my seat, for MP for Rarieda on UDA. I think he got 120 votes out of 75,000 votes. So would you really be saying that not granting somebody a UDA certificate in Ugunja or Rarieda is to deny anybody, all of the 120 people, their democratic rights against the votes I got, which are over 50,000? You know, sometimes you need reality, you know, and the reality just dictates that it would be a waste of time for UDA to try to run a UDA candidate in Ugunja. And it would be a waste of time for ODM to try to run an ODM candidate deep in Rift Valley, which is almost exclusively UDA. That's just a reality. It's not a question of denying anybody democratic rights.
Do you think that under the broad-based agreement that there is, especially when we talk about Parliament, you've described the situation in Parliament where you find opposition members who ought to leave as oppositions and check the government, find themselves singing Kumbaya to government because they think they are in government. Will there ever get to a point where, despite broad-based government, that National Assembly, and I think National Assembly has more powers than even the executive, because anything executive wants has to pass through Parliament. As member of ODM and part of broad-based, what are some of the interests, negotiations, talks that you're having with your members so that you maintain the structure, the cornerstone of what opposition is, despite being in broad-based?
You know, and it's no secret that within ODM, there have always been two factions. There's the faction that believes that we are working with government in the context of the 10-point agenda. But then there's the faction that believe we are the government because of the framework agreement. Those factions were there even when Mzee was alive. And you know that he supported the democratic right of expression of both. Yeah. Whenever anyone spoke, he would say that is okay. That is, you know, I don't think that those factions will go away even now. Those who believe they are in government will continue so believing, and I don't think there's anything you will tell them that will persuade them otherwise. Those who believe we are working with government for now up to 2027, we will maintain that. Okay. The only thing we can continue urging, you know, the dynamics of Parliament is also funny. As the ODM signed the framework agreement to work with government, there are UDA MPs, especially from the Mount Kenya region, who have, for all intents and purposes, exited that UDA arrangement.
Right.
So that although they were elected and technically are part of the UDA government, factually, they have exited. So as some of us who believe we're in government in ODM have essentially gone in, there's also another group who have come out, okay? So that there's still a number in Parliament, a substantial number, big enough to be able to check the executive in terms of proposals on legislation or other motions, yeah? And all I urge, whether those who believe they are in or out, is that we must remember as Parliament that in the constitutional structure of Parliament, the executive and government is not in Parliament. Parliament, we only have the majority and the minority. We do not have the government and the opposition. And so as I've kept urging us, I urge both the leadership of Parliament and members of Parliament to remember that collectively, it is our business to check on the executive, not determine that now I'm in government or not, because government is outside Parliament. It's not in Parliament. And it's a reminder I keep doing, and I hope that a lot of my colleagues will keep listening.
You know, Parliament has been accused of being captured, but many pundits would say that Parliament has ceded its power to the executive. And with that, just where do you sit? Is Parliament captured, that all executive does is what will happen? And where do you think that lies with the people of Kenya?
Parliament is captured, obviously, and I explained this earlier. First of all, The coincidence that we have my very good friend, Honorable Wetangula, as Speaker, and yet is also a party leader of one of the coalitions of the ruling party, by definition, means he cannot be independent. That's number one. Number two, the coincidence that the person who is elected president is also the same party that has the majority in parliament, and it's a coincidence because it need not be. He could as well come from the minority. But that coincidence gives the ruling party a majority in parliament, which therefore makes parliament subservient to the wishes of the UDA arrangement. And that's a coincidence. Thirdly, even though some members of the UDA have now factually retreated, the fact that based on the broad-based agreement, there are some of our members who have re-entered to fill those spaces has ensured that the ruling party, which is also the executive, basically has a super majority in parliament. Now, it is not strange. Even in the US, which essentially is the same as our structured presidential system, you know that as long as the Republicans have the supermajority in the Senate and the lower house, Trump's wishes will always flow. And that is what actually happens. So it's not quite unique to us. Yeah. So we can't really blame ourselves that much. It's just the reality of the day that as long as the president has a supermajority in parliament, parliament will always be subservient to the executive.
With the hope that parliamentarians are actually applying some kind of thought, intelligence, strategic thinking to the decisions that they make, and not just making blanket statements or blanket laws, blanket legislation by virtue of the fact that the president has the majority. That's the hope. That
is a hope in which I share and I practice. And it is my belief, and I said earlier, that there are a number of members who, despite this arrangement, maintain, including those who are originally in UDA, maintain some level of independent thinking and contribution and do so. Actually, there are a number of members who do so. It is my hope that collectively, those numbers can increase and, check. In fact, I was telling the president the other day, you remember I was ombudsman before this?
Yes.
And one time I was called to State House and I used to issue a lot of edicts against the president and against the executive. And I was very unpopular with President Uhuru then and the deputy Ruto. So one time I was invited to State House and I went. And as they were moving around, the President Uhuru and William Ruto then came to my table, and President Uhuru asked me, Otiende, why are you always against us? Why are you always, attacking us? I told him, Mr. President, I'm paid by the taxpayers to do exactly that. If I don't do that, then I should not earn my pay. And he laughed and went. That is precisely what it should be. In criticizing, in checking the executive, you are actually helping the presidency to be better and the executive. It is not that therefore you are undermining them. And that is something that the president and the executive need to understand, that to have a robust parliament that sometimes checks and even adjusts certain things actually helps the president maintain some sort of equilibrium in the country. It is not a way of showing disloyalty. It is the highest level of loyalty to the presidency and to the people of Kenya. And it is my hope that a lot of my colleagues will adopt that.
Yet when these objections happen, you hear words of development will not come to your area. And you find development has been painted such that you must support the government for development to come to your area. Makes it seem as if development is something we beg for, yet it is a right for each and every person. So then how do you deal with that in broad-based or in parliament, knowing very well that that is what the executive thinks? And how do we correct that notion so that we don't have members of parliament? I remember it was a problem even when Raila Odinga was there, when members of parliament went to State House to beg for development. And Raila said, it is not a matter of begging. It is your right. How do we cure that notion from parliament and to the executive?
It is actually the greatest joke of all time. That as members of parliament who make the budget and determine everything in the budget, that you should go to State House to beg that certain things be put in the budget when we are the ones who make it. And that is why I have not done that myself. Which is also the reason why I have been advocating for maintenance of the Constituency Development Fund I even sponsored the amendment to the Constitution for that very reason. The reason is simple. Remove the Constituency Development Fund and everything it does in the constituency. The only way anything will happen then is if your member of parliament goes to State House to line in the queue and beg that, could you please build for me these 10 laboratories?
Right.
Could you please construct for me these classrooms? Could you please give me a police station and construct it? You know, all those are things that you would do independently. The Constituency Development Fund gives you enough money to bring development to your area or influence it without having to beg the president or anyone else. If you exit the Constituency Development Fund and you are talking of that culture of going to beg the president, that culture will increase 100-fold. Your member of parliament will not be a member of parliament without going to beg the president. And the traditional power, you remember Moi in his heydays, when people would go to State House with briefcases, and then you are told, now enter that room, I hear, this is what we hear. And then they stack it with hundreds of thousands, then you are now told to go. And I'm told that whenever you carry that briefcase, the guys at the gate also know that you've been given money. So before they open for you the gates of State House, they say, na yetu ye. Now, that is a culture we should finish. In fact, I really want to encourage the president to discourage this culture of going to line up in State House to beg for things, because it encourages a very bad culture of dependency, and it is actually what encourages corruption. Let members of parliament, if they have any request, you can place those requests in the formal channels.
Yes.
Okay? And you can also influence those developments through the CDF, but not to keep going to State House to beg for this or that. But
he invites them to State House.
That's why I'm saying I'm encouraging the president to discourage. You remember President Kibaki did not have that. Yes. That culture bears other things that are not good for this country.
Okay. He's insistent that Kenya will become a first world country. And while there are all the politics that play out, and of course in the moment where we're looking at and, still interrogating the different things that Raila Odinga did over the years to then fight for freedom, whether it was flag independence that was sought or real true independence, whether it was economic independence, administrative independence across the line, there seems to be a fight now to move from where Kenya is, where we academically they say we don't like saying third and first world anymore. We want to talk about global regions, to move from one place to the other. The first world is what the president has spoken of very often. And he talks about joining hands together to take Kenya from one place to the next. Many are of the opinion that you can't put old wine in new wineskins, that you have to change the skin in order for the wine to remain fresh. That there's certain things that need to happen in order for real development to take place. And everybody who is in this dispensation is being called upon to do what they can, plus those who will be invited to join later, to do what they can to ensure that Kenya moves. Are the things that need to be done being done in order for that dream to be realized, whether it's at the legislative, whether it's at the judicial, whether it's at the executive, across board? Or is this just a dream?
Well, I support the president for dreaming.
Oh, okay.
I support the president for dreaming, and I think together with him, we as Kenyans, we should join him in that dream, because it is not a far-fetched dream. It is something that is doable. I think what he has done, and which I agree with, is to try and reduce focus on the short term and focus on the long term. Eventually, what will help us move to the first world is the focus on the long term, as opposed to the short term of the 5 years of presidency, for example. If we can do what was done when Vision 2030 was being conceived, you are looking at 30 to 50 years ahead. And that, I think, is what he's refocusing on. It's a good thing. In my opinion, at least 4 things must be focused on right now, if you are to do that. One is respecting independence of institutions, whether it's parliament, whether it's the judiciary, whether it's the independent offices and constitutional commissions, but institutions so that institutions can work and not be taking instructions either way. 2 is reducing corruption. I think corruption is the one thing that betrays us the most. And it is one where I am not sure we are having any market improvement. In fact, there are signs that it is worsening. And it is worsening because of a number of things. In my opinion, the highest office in the land must demonstrate intolerance to corruption. As long as there's a perception of tolerance by the highest office, corruption will increase. It will not decrease. 3, I think we must enhance fiscal discipline. Fiscal discipline is at the top of all this. And lastly, I would say, having strategic policies. We are not doing well in some of this. The truth is there's a perception, even about parliament, even about the judiciary, even about the executive, of tolerance to corruption. And that means that particular index we are not doing well on. In terms of respect of institutions, we are not doing well in that respect. I think there's an effort to improve fiscal discipline, which is encouraging in many respects. I think there's an effort to have strategic policies in various areas. What I would say is that the dream towards the first world is a good one. And that dream, unfortunately, you can't wait for new wines. The wine has to be served anyway. So whether it's new or old wine, you will not have a situation where you have new wine in terms of new leadership, because unfortunately, our very political structure, Udwak or even Dennis, if however clean you are and you said you wanted to be president, you will go nowhere unless you have a substantial amount of money. You will not tell Kenyans, I am very clean, I want to be your president. You will, on average, a presidential campaign in this country, I think requires, I understand, between at least 5 billion Kenyan shillings. Where will you get 5 billion? If you have your 1 million shillings and you say, I'm very clean and I want to be, a president, the very Kenyans will just laugh at you because you will not be able to campaign in Todonyang, where you have to fly and give materials of your party, and at the same day fly to Kisumu and then do another rally in Mombasa. You need tons and tons of... The very political structure of our country is such that you can only have certain people run for presidency. And therefore, you cannot wait to start the changes when your ideal person is the president. If President Ruto can help us move some way in this regard, it is a good thing. Yes.
All that you've spoken about in terms of the dream that you share with President William Ruto and what we need to fix, one message that Kenyans continue to push for is the fidelity to the Constitution and the rule of law. If we just implement the Constitution 2010 and we live by the spirit of the Constitution, all these problems will be handled. Why does it seem to be so difficult to just live by that document?
It is because, and we had this reality when, as the committee of experts, we were writing the Constitution. We recognized that we wrote a Constitution that was actually ahead of its time and ahead of its people. The ideals and structure of the Constitution of Kenya is ahead of the reality of the country of Kenya. And therefore, to say and expect Kenyans to live by within the four corners of the Constitution is to be overly ambitious. What we must do is to encourage them to progressively work towards living by those ideals. Because Kenya as a country has certain things and the very structure. Look, take corruption for example. We want politicians who are corruption-free. But no person will ever be elected an MCA who does not give money to that very electorate. Hakuna. That very electorate is the one that will demand. You know, where I come from, and this was the reality when I started politics in the year 2004. And I had a very long agenda of what I wanted to do for the people of Rarieda. So I called this very big meeting, especially of young people. And I stood and I started narrating to them in fluent Luo what I want to do, my 10-point agenda, one by one. When I got to the third, some young man raised his hand and I ignored him. I went to my fourth point. Instead of taking back his hand, he raised it higher. He kept raising it.
Yeah.
And so out of irritation, I told him, okay, now, what is it that you can't wait me finish? Then he told me, you know, Otiende, we know you and we love you. And we've heard you say these points even on radio. So for us gathered here, and there were like 3,000 of them, we already agree with you. So why don't you save your time and ours by unbinding us? Just give us our share. We go, then you go somewhere else where they've not had this. Unbinding means give us money, we go home. All this kizungu mingi you are telling us, we don't need. And that is the attitude of the electorate. Yeah. You see? So we are in a country where some of these things we are trying to finish, it is so embedded in the very people who you ought who ought to be fighting to finish them. And that's why it's difficult to work within the four corners of the Constitution. But we must still endeavor to progressively work within the Constitution. That's the reality of the ground.
Indeed. And, you know, we're winding down on this, but then let's take a larger picture view of this and come back again a little bit to the party. That you've also alluded to certain realities that could come about in the next 1.5 years in terms of what will happen in the next general election and who will field whom and what exactly will happen. Let's play in that ideal position for a moment. If ODM were to field their own candidate for the presidency, leave alone that there are 5 other elections that happen, which we know folks will be fielded across board. Does this mean, number one, that there will then be a split from the broad-based government? And number two, does ODM then believe it has the capacity, the wherewithal, and the very gravitas that it needs to then be able to field somebody who will win a presidential election?
Thank you. Does it mean that there would be a split on that account? No. Because the broad-based arrangement is an arrangement up to 2027. To consider and field a candidate would not be going against the broad-based arrangement because the framework agreement is time-bound. And by that alone, that would not cause a split within ODM because everyone is clear that this is a time-bound agreement. 2, would the ODM have the capacity to field a candidate? Certainly, yes. So far, ODM still remains the biggest and largest party with the greatest representation in this country. And as long as ODM settle on a candidate, by agreement and negotiation, then we would activate all our networks in the country to that end. The question of who it is, it would be premature to discuss. There are 3 scenarios that are likely to play, and any of them could play up. 1, ODM fielding its own presidential candidate is a possibility.
Okay.
Even if that candidate could be William Ruto or any other person who chooses to join the ODM, that is an open question. Okay. 2, ODM could choose not to field a candidate at the presidency level, but field candidates in all other positions and enter a pre-election pact, whether with President Ruto or anybody else. And that pre-election pact, in that event, would be one that defines then what are we getting for foregoing that opportunity.
Okay.
What is on the table? Are you offering the position, say, of a deputy president and several other positions? Are you offering any other position, and in what ratios? Because to forego fielding a presidential candidate must be something that there's a serious consideration in return. Or 3, ODM could field a presidential candidate and win, or if it does not win, can still enter a post-election pact with any other entity. So any of those possibilities are possible.
Okay.
But the point is, the arrangement we have now is time-bound. It's up to 2027. Anybody who speaks of 2027 is expressing an individual opinion, not the opinion of our departed leader, not the opinion of the party so far, but a personal opinion, which is also allowed.
Okay.
So we have a poll that we had put earlier, and the question was, is the government doing right by the people? You're part of a broad-based government. 84% said no. 16% said yes. Number of votes, 2,279.
It is a matter to note.
It is a matter to note.
It is obviously a call for government to improve. Yes, and it is good to have such constant, reviews, because it is the people who elect the government from the presidency and everyone else, and it is the people who then must know whether we are on the right track or not. Some people usually say maybe those who are voting is because they're misguided and all. But even when people go to vote for you, no one ever asks them why they're voting for you. So that vote in itself is important, whichever way it goes.
Indeed.
Yes.
You've done 2 hours.
Wow.
Time flies when you're having fun.
I didn't even realize.
Exactly. Time flies when you're having fun.
Otiende
Amollo is the Member of Parliament for Rarieda Constituency. He's been here with us this morning.